Jeff Morley, I am such a fan of your Substack. I read your book.
Man.
By the way, your book, Our Man in Mexico, is not on Audible. So with my dyslexia, I slogged through the thing. CIA and JFK, I've got that one on Audible. I have listened. I have argued with friends. And I always say, if you want as many facts as you can possibly get, you want to go to Jeff Morley and the work that he does, because he's not some kook that is, got this he just simply follows the facts. You were a kid when you were in kindergarten when Kennedy got killed. You were a journalist in the 80s. You started following along with this stuff in 1992 when Congress and JFK Records Act was passed. They said you got to release all the stuff. And then at that point, you must have been like a kid in a candy store because, here it is. Yeah. Here it is.
Yeah.
You're thinking, okay.
No, and you got to understand, John, before that, there was nothing.
Right.
There was nothing on. There was no original documentation. You had the Warren Commission report. You had the Church Committee. You had the House Select Committee on Assassinations. You had the final document. But you didn't have the documents that the people who had written those reports had relied on. All you had was footnotes. And all of the documents were secret. That started to change in the early 90s, and that's when I really got on the story.
Right. So in 92, they say they're going to release them. There were 320,000 documents due to be released. I think the last thing I saw was a debate you were having with this guy, Michael something or other, and I think you said there's 3,600 additional documents that still need to be replaced or released. It was Mike Pompeo that went to Trump in 2017 and said, don't release him.
Yeah. So, just to back up. So, Congress said release all these records in 92, and they put a 25-year sunset on it. They said, okay, the CIA can delay because of, a living agent or a sensitive operation or privacy, for 10 years. But if somebody dies, then their name becomes public, that sort of thing. But after 25 years, everything was supposed to come public. So, in October 2017, the thing lands on the desk of President Trump. And the CIA Mike Pompeo goes to Trump and says, you can't possibly release this. And Trump tweets, all the JFK documents are released ahead of time. Okay. They weren't all released. And the ones that were released weren't released ahead of time.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a sham. But Pompeo prevailed under the influence of other CIA officials. Pompeo prevailed on Trump to keep redactions in about 15,000 documents at that point. So Trump said, fine. To Trump's credit, he did release some. Really only documents that the CIA wanted released. But Trump basically kicked the can down the road and said, in 4 years, we'll revisit this. So in October 2021, it came to Biden. Mm-hmm. So Biden said, well, COVID, we're not going to deal with this for another year. So, the Washington Post called me up and said, what do you think of this? I said, this is like the COVID dog ate my homework.
Yes.
This is like the lamest excuse ever, right? It's 25 years. The deadline's passed. We're 4 years past the blown deadline, and you say, we can't do it because of COVID? What have you been doing for 29 years, if not preparing for what the law says you have to do? Anyway, Biden goes along with the CIA. He, like Trump, he holds some documents back and he releases others. So now we're down to about 3,600 documents in the JFK Records collection at the National Archives that still contain redactions. That's the nut of the thing going forward.
But the good news is, as you have found, is that Congress is now budgeting to have all the documents released and digitized. And I don't know if that means all the documents. I guess the reason they didn't want to, and Mike Pompeo was head of the CIA prior, was that if we release some of these names that are out there and these people are still alive, their lives might be threatened because somehow they were caught up in all of this. So they had to wait basically for everybody to die, right?
No, that explanation is nonsense. No, it is. It's a classic CIA sleight of hand, okay? There's 3,600 documents that still contain redactions. How many names of living people are in those 3,600 documents? Maybe a dozen. That's not the reason this information is being withheld. I was just looking at a document that's being withheld. Okay, it's about CIA operations in Mexico in 1963. Okay, it's a 79-page document. 75 pages are entirely redacted. Okay, that's not 75 pages of names of living agents. That's 75 pages of highly sensitive CIA Mexican operations, in the 1960s. So this idea we're protecting living agents, no, they're protecting sensitive relationships with other intelligence services in 1963. But because those relationships in 1963 are still, we still have good relations with Mexico. Yeah. So that's why they're hiding stuff. It's not because of living agents. That is a classic CIA BS diversionary tactic.
Here's one I can illustrate that you talk about, because you're like a dog on a bone. And again, you don't have a dog in this fight. You just want to know, okay, what are the facts? And if it doesn't smell right to you, you immediately go, well, why? Like, for instance, they hire a husband and wife that are situated, living in an apartment across the street from the embassy in Mexico in the 60s. And their job is to take pictures of everybody coming in and out of this embassy. When the mother and the father go out to have lunch, the son, who, by the way, eventually moves to the state of Washington and works for a car dealer, he takes over and starts taking photos. You find out that the mother said, oh, yeah, there's a picture of Oswald. I have a picture of Oswald at the age of 23 going into that embassy in Mexico. Oswald went in there to try to, I guess was he trying to get his passport back, or was he trying to get a visa to get out of the country? Right?
He was trying to get a visa to travel to Cuba and then to the Soviet Union. So he went to the Cuban consulate and the Soviet embassy seeking to get a visa, which he was unsuccessful. I just want to say one thing. The woman who was taking the pictures, Greta Goyena-Chia, whose son, like you said, lives in Washington State, she held that job for about 10 years. Okay, she didn't say that she had the photograph. The way the procedure worked was she took photographs of people coming and going from the embassy. Andres took pictures also. She was kind of her assistant. Then they would take the film and they would give it to a CIA courier who would develop it and deliver it to the CIA headquarters. So she did not have possession of a photograph of Oswald. She did tell Andres when Oswald appeared on TV, after his arrest, she said, oh, yeah, I took his picture coming and going from the Soviet embassy. So that picture was delivered to the CIA because that's what she did for a living. She delivered photographs. So the CIA has always denied that they got a picture of Oswald in Mexico City. And it's only important in the JFK story in that that's part of the cover story of the CIA, that we didn't know anything about Oswald. And so the story was we didn't get a photograph of him. Well, Andres Goyena-Chia's story about his mother shows that they did get a photograph. And it's a very solid story. The reason that I even knew who he was because of looking at the CIA documents that have been released in recent years. And they accidentally, I think, released the name, unredacted the name of the Goyena-Chia family. And that's how I was able to track them down.
So this is where you see, Jeff, this doesn't make sense. They're lying about this, because Oswald had been monitored by the CIA for 4 years, from 1959 to 1963. The CIA had all of his home addresses. So they obviously knew who he was. He is somehow involved in this, but they deny. And even when the evidence presented, we never heard of this guy before.
Right. So it used to be, in the CIA, plausible deniability is everything, right? You want to be able to plausibly deny that you're involved in the events that you just created, okay? Yeah. So for a long time, the CIA had plausible deniability around Oswald. But given all the records that have been released in recent years, right, their denials are no longer plausible. All they have is implausible deniability. They keep retailing back this story to us. Oh, we didn't know anything about that guy. And we now know that's nonsense. Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused assassin who denied killing Kennedy, was a very well-known quantity to senior CIA officers a month before the assassination. That's an established fact. Now, Is it negligence, intentional negligence, complicity, or is this just outstanding work by the U.S. intelligence community? I mean, you can't tell, from the record, just from the record and all the testimony, you can't tell for sure. And I'm not going to construct a conspiracy theory to explain it all, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's up to the CIA to tell us what happened because the official story is not true. Okay, so they should tell us what actually happened. That's where I come from in this.
So let me throw one at you. So Oswald needs a job, goes to his neighbor and says, "Hey, I need a job." And they said, "Oh, the book depository, you can get a job there." Right? That's the neighbor. So like, this is something my son brought up. How could the neighbor tell him to go get a job there? Was the neighbor also in on this? So he gets a job at the book depository, right? And in order to get access to that building.
I mean, we don't know that. We do know the story that you tell is true. A woman named Ruth Payne said that she had heard that there were jobs available at the book depository. And that's how Oswald went and got the job in October 1963. Now, at that very moment, mid-October 1963, when Oswald's getting the job at the Texas School Book Depository, he is a figure of interest to senior CIA officers in Langley, Virginia, in CIA headquarters. So I'm not saying there's a causal relationship between those two. I know of none.
Yeah.
But it is true that at that moment, he was not unknown to the CIA. He was very well known to, a small group of people at the CIA.
So as the characters are all moving about in this plot, at the same time, Jeff, above it is this, that the Cuban crisis was occurring, and JFK decides to go in with the Bay of Pigs. That thing fails miserably. They said to him at the time, "Hey, we want to get, if it doesn't go well," because they're trying to overthrow, because Castro had overthrown the dictator. He says, "Hey, well, I'm going to be a good guy. I'm going to be fine." Then pressure comes in from the United States. Don't trust Castro. Don't trust him. Castro then goes to Russia and says, "Hey, can you help me?" So now the Russians and Castro are going to work together, which only makes the United States that much more concerned. They decide they're going to go in there. They're going to see this overthrow, get rid of Castro. They do the Bay of Pigs. It fails. But prior to it failing, they say to young JFK, "Hey, listen, you want to have some planes as backups to get our guys out of there if this thing blows up and, things don't go well." They disguise a couple of planes to make it look like they are Cuban planes. And at the last minute, Kennedy decides, no, don't do it. We don't want to incur the wrath of Gorbachev or of Russia. So Kennedy basically lets those guys get killed. So he figures it's done. Right? Yeah. Isn't that part of what's happening?
One important point. There's one important point, which is before the whole thing happened, okay, Kennedy said, there will be no overt U.S. involvement. So, and the question was, can we send in planes afterward, to support this? And JFK said, no, there's no U.S. involvement. As long as there's no U.S. involvement, it can go ahead. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so when the men invade at the Bay of Pigs, they hit the beach. Castro has arrayed his forces there because he knows they're coming, and he pins them down and crushes them. I mean, a lot of people are killed. The rest are taken captured, and the whole thing was like over in 24 hours.
Right.
And it's like David and Goliath story. This 33-year-old Cuban leader in power for less than a year has defeated the American empire. And so it's a humiliating defeat for the CIA. I mean, it's unbelievably humiliating defeat. But Kennedy said, look, I told you that I wasn't going to authorize air support, and I didn't. I don't want to do that. He didn't want to start his presidency with an invasion of Cuba, which is basically what the CIA had presented him with when his plan failed. And so Kennedy was like, no, I'm not going there. And that was the origin of tremendous bitterness, both in South Florida, among the anti-Castro exiles, and in the upper ranks of the CIA and the Pentagon.
So, Jeff Morley, you point out that right as soon as word broke that Kennedy was not going to get involved in a war, his ratings went from 60 to 80%, an increase almost overnight. Never seen before that type of increase, because it was like, wow, look at this. We've got a president who's going to try to end this Cold War without firing a shot. And it was that point that the CIA hawks and those that wanted, nothing to do, stop Khrushchev, stop them. That was the beginning of that friction that, from all of your work, points to the fact that they did not want that guy to be president of the United States.
I mean, during the missile crisis of October 1962, when the Soviet Union has installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, and Kennedy manages to defuse the situation, and like you say, shoots up in the polls, right? Peace was popular. After that, Kennedy in 1963 is a very different president, especially in foreign policy, than he is in 1961 and 62. Before that, he's kind of a conventional politician, not that different from Eisenhower, adhering to the mainstream consensus. But when he glimpsed the possibility of nuclear war, and think of it, you're one man, and he was very close. He was probably within 48 hours of being not just asked, but almost ordered to launch an invasion of Cuba that we now know almost certainly would have resulted in a nuclear exchange of unthinkable consequences.
We're going to stop. Jeff, will you stay with us? Because here are a couple questions. I want to talk about who you think fired the shots. I know that you're holding off on that. But also, I want to talk about Jack Ruby and the psychiatrist that went in to interview him. And you found out who that guy was, explaining why Oswald, why did he all of a sudden go home and get a pistol to save his life if he wasn't the patsy? We'll handle all of that. Plus, we've got a whole bunch of questions as well. I so much appreciate your expertise and the time you're giving us. Will you stay with us?
Sure.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You'll excuse the fact that I'm out of breath, but about 10 or 15 minutes ago, a tragic thing, from all indications at this point, has happened in the city of Dallas. Let me quote to you this. And you'll excuse me if I am out of breath. A bulletin, this is from the United Press, from Dallas. President Kennedy and Governor John Curley have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas. They were riding in an open automobile when the shots were fired. The president, his limp body carried in the arms of his wife, Jacqueline, has rushed to Parkland Hospital. And if you'll excuse me if I give some directions and we talk about what we're going to do here for the next few minutes. But, Bobby, let's tape this, if you please, particularly the interview with the eyewitness people.
That was WFAA. As the story broke, we're on the phone now with Jeff Morley. I would say, Mr. Morley, if people want to basically have a guy that just follows the facts where they lead and questions the things that just don't seem to add up. It is your Substack, JFK Facts, your books, Our Man in Mexico, and JFK and CIA. I so much appreciate your time. Let's dig into this. We've talked about what was happening internationally with the CIA. They don't like the fact that Kennedy is not a war hawk, that he wasn't going to go in and take care of Castro. So now the CIA has been, they changed their tune a little bit on Kennedy. And now you start to see, well, okay, they don't like the fact that he's disobeying them. At the time, John McCone was the director of the CIA, and he is coming to Dallas. And at this point, here are the questions for you. Are you ready?
Sure.
We'll start with
who chose the route that the limousine would be on, and who also okayed that it would be a convertible.
Okay, on the route, the question was, where was Kennedy going to speak after the motorcade? So he arrives at Dallas Love Field in the morning of November 22nd, 1963. He greets a friendly crowd. They get into a motorcade and they go on an 8-mile ride through the heart of Dallas and into Dealey Plaza, and they're on their way to the Trade Mart, where Kennedy was going to give a speech at lunch. So that was the plan. And that plan had been settled on a few days before. There was a question of where would the president speak. So the final route was established. There's a lot of, inevitably when you get into the details, there's a lot of dispute about what actually happened. But the route that he took was taken a couple of days before November 22nd. So who determined the route? It was determined by that Kennedy was going to speak at the Trade Mart. Now, there were a couple of different ways to get to the trademark. And here's the important thing that I think people need to understand. Kennedy didn't have to go through that place where he went through in Dealey Plaza, where they take a slow left-hand turn and they go, and that's where the gunfire erupted, which was, in retrospect, a very exposed place. But the important thing is, we now know about Secret Service protection for Kennedy throughout the fall of 1963. He's looking ahead to re-election in 1964, so he's starting to take political trips, and he takes a number of them between September, October, November 1963. We now have researchers. Vince Palomara is one of the best ones. We've gone back and looked and found video. The security around Kennedy's visits to other cities in the fall of 1963 is markedly more strict than it was in Dallas. Dallas is clearly the most lax security of any city that Kennedy is in like 10 cities in the fall of 1963. So there's a clear breakdown. And it goes down to the basics of Secret Service work. Like, do you put somebody on the top of every tall building? Okay. Mm-hmm. In Kennedy's other visits in 1963, that happens. That doesn't happen in Dallas. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a trip to Chicago, which is actually canceled because there's talk of a possible assassination attempt in Chicago on November 1st, 1963. So, that's what we now know about what was going on was the security, the Secret Service security in Dallas was the weakest and the most permissive of any of Kennedy's visits.
I hate to do this, but we're going to jump ahead.
Sure.
Shots ring out. The president is killed. Jack Ruby kills Oswald. And you've been able to show that it wasn't Oswald. Oswald says, I was a patsy. I was set up by this. You believe, although you can't get to the person who actually pulled the trigger, that the CIA actually killed Kennedy. It was not shots from the book depository.
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, there's a lot of evidence, compelling evidence from the doctors who tried to save Kennedy's life, from the people who participated in JFK's autopsy that night, that the president was hit by gunfire from two different directions. That's very strong evidence. That's not like the invention of some conspiracy theorist. That's sworn testimony from medical professionals. So if that's the case, then what happened? What was going on? And what I say is, if you see the level of CIA activity around Oswald and interest in him, it bears all the marks of a CIA covert operation, where you manipulate, you watch somebody, but without working through cutouts, so that you're never directly connected with them. And here's the important thing to remember. The CIA knew a whole lot about Lee Harvey Oswald well before Kennedy was killed. And this is what's happened. This is what's come out in the last 10 or 20 years that the mainstream media won't report about, that Congress isn't interested in, and even so-called conspiracy theorists haven't paid that much attention to. The official story is not true. I mean, people have been saying that for a long time, but now we have a firm factual basis for saying that. Yeah. The idea that Lee Harvey Oswald was a quote-unquote lone nut who came out of nowhere, nobody knew who he was a loser, he was pathetic, how could we have possibly ever thought that he might kill the president? Factually speaking, that's nonsensical. The CIA monitored Oswald for 4 years before Kennedy was killed. They had a 180-page file on him on November 21st, 1963. President Kennedy is very alive, and the CIA knows a whole lot about Lee Harvey Oswald.
I only have 1 minute left, so I have to ask this question. So Jack Ruby, somebody lets him in. He fires a shot that kills Oswald. Then a doctor, a psychiatrist, goes in and interviews Ruby. We find from your work, Jeff, that the psychiatrist was also a CIA operative as well. So he concocts this thing that Ruby was just insane or just some garbage to it. But why?
Well,
right?
Yeah.
But why Ruby? Why did Ruby do it?
I don't think Ruby had any choice. I mean, Oswald captured alive. Oswald on trial was a nightmare for the CIA and for Kennedy's enemies because he denied doing the crime, but he had some knowledge of what was going on. He said, "I'm a patsy," right? He didn't say I'm innocent. He said, "I'm a patsy,"
right.
which means other people did it, and they're laying the blame on me. So, Oswald is eliminated so that he can't talk about what he knows about the situation he was in.
There's so much here, and for people, and I know there are millions and millions of people all in the United States and around the world that want to know. So continue to follow the great work. There are more documents to be released at some point, but the first place for everybody to go is to Jeff's work. Jeff Morley's work there, the CIA, JFK, CIA, the book, Our Man in Mexico. I'll continue to follow your Substacks as you get more and more information on this.
And people should go to JFK Facts on Substack.
Yes.
That's where my reporting appears.
It's great. God, thank you for your work. For a guy that grows up and just follows the facts and then continues on this thing, let's find out what really happened. And, Jeff, I think it all starts with you and your hard work. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks a million, man.
Okay. Bye-bye.